So, a couple weeks ago, I put out this video essentially trying to look at multiple variables when answering whether someone is natural or not. And this is because in modern day social media, probably like more than, ever before, there are so many guys who kind of draw a bit of, to put it nicely, healthy skepticism as to whether they are in fact 100% natural as they claim to be. See, the way I think of it is that if you have someone that you're a little skeptical about, the best way to think of it, more than just some yes or no binary, is to plot them on a probability spectrum. This way, everybody who has pretty much ever picked up a weight, they're gonna end up somewhere on this spectrum. Now, where you actually start out on this spectrum initially, this is going to be dependent on how big you are, just how muscular you are. And in my opinion, the best way to go about this, to just overall simplify things, would be the FFMI, the Fat-Free Mass Index. Now, at this point, you have pretty much caught up to where I left off in that first video, but as you can tell, the bulk of the work, it is still yet to be done. And this is because you can't simply look at this from a univariable, that is one variable standpoint. And let me give you an example as to why. This is Quinton Iria, an IFBB pro bodybuilder with multiple top 5 finishes at Tampa, Romania, and even my home city of Toronto, Canada. He stands 6'1", 270 pounds while being lean, which by the way is a prerequisite. If you'll remember from the last video, you need to be relatively lean before you run any comparisons or calculations involving the FFMI. Anyway, these stats give Quinton a ridiculous FFMI of 32, and so I think it goes without saying that he is not unfamiliar with special vitamins. However, and by the way, this is the part of the video where I think half of you guys are gonna just absolutely flip your shit in my comment section. This is him at 21 years old, and at least according to him, in this photo, this physique is still natural. Now, clearly there has been, a bit of an upgrade here, namely 50 pounds of lean muscle mass, but still, this physique is one which probably many people out there would consider to be impossible to achieve naturally. However, the somewhat maybe surprising thing for many of you out there watching is that I do believe him when he says that this physique was him natural at the time, because look at what the fuck happened to him after he stopped claiming to be natural. When we talk about these 1 in a million genetic elite examples, yeah, this is it. And so the reason I bring all of this up is to establish the need to look at variables beyond the FFMI, beyond solely looking at whether an individual is kind of big. At least within a reasonable range, that is. Because once you're looking at IFBB pro bodybuilders, come on, bro. What the fuck? So one thing you'll notice with natural bodybuilders, even high-level natural pro bodybuilders, is that they never really stay that lean for long periods of time. There are just way too many negative side effects that come with you trying to perpetually live your life 365 days a year at under 10% body fat, especially if you're actually trying to retain muscle mass. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously they may cut down, they may look really good, even shredded, for a few weeks or even a month or two, but eventually everybody usually snaps back to a much more sustainable level of body fat. However, when it comes to the use of PEDs, of performance-enhancing drugs, it kind of changes the equation a little bit, or a lot in some cases. For example, number one, they are going to increase your basal metabolic rate, meaning that you are now going to essentially burn more body fat while eating the same amount of calories as you did back when you were natural. There is a theory that they also improve nutrient partitioning, which is kind of like a fancy way of saying that now your body has more of a propensity to shuttle nutrients to muscle cells as opposed to other areas of the body, such as for fat storage. And then there's even direct hormonal effects, for example, Anavar, which is a very popular oral anabolic steroid, this one has been shown to have direct interactions in the body which are going to have an impact on thyroid hormone levels, which will once again increase your metabolic rate. And then there's other stuff which actually doesn't fall under the umbrella of anabolic steroids, such as clenbuterol, which is a thermogenic. This stuff actually, it's not even prescribed for human use anymore by the FDA. No, now it is only used to treat asthma in horses. Now, as to how it actually applies on our spectrum, think of it this way. If you have someone who is lean and shredded for 365 days a year, I am talking this guy has not been over 10% body fat since before the MCU went to shit. Then yeah, we're gonna move you a bit towards the right on our natural spectrum. So, I think I haven't brought up my favorite chart in a while, and I think I'm overdue for my annual discussion about everybody's favorite bodybuilding concept, the law of diminishing return. See, the crappy thing is, despite what we would all like to believe, you can't just keep on putting on muscle year after year at the same rate until you're 40 years old and you're walking around looking like the Incredible Hulk. You're probably going to experience the most gains of your entire life, probably like the first 1 to 2 years, give or take, and then it's going to just exponentially decrease in every subsequent year. This is because the actual stimulus of just going to the gym and picking up heavy things, this is never going to be as new of a stimulus for your body as it is in those first 1 to 2 years. I mean, yes, you could perfect your technique. You can do progressive overload. You can spend 17 hours a day frantically looking up the most optimal training strategies of the month. But still, even that is not enough. And also there are some other weird biological things like myostatin, for example, which is literally a protein in your body that stops you from growing past a certain point. If you ever want to see something really weird, Google genetically modified myostatin deficient animals, and you're literally going to see cows and bulls and stuff that looks like it's been crossbred with Ronnie Coleman. It's pretty wild. However, if you have someone who does seem to fluctuate quite a bit, or they have a very non-standard kind of rate of muscle gain, this can kind of it's not a red flag, but it's a little bit of a yellow or orange flag that goes off in my head. A good example of this, I would say, is Zac Efron. I actually just saw The Iron Claw last night, and by the way, off topic, that was such a good movie. I'm very sad that more people don't know about it and that there is virtually no Oscar buzz. This was probably one of the best movies I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. If you guys haven't seen it, I'm telling you right now, do yourself a favor, go watch it. But one thing I couldn't help but notice the entire time I saw Zac on screen was we have seen you when you were younger in your High School Musical days, and you probably did some working out. You were a teenage heartthrob, and then we saw you kind of blow up a little bit for Baywatch. And even back then, he had some steroid accusations online. People were saying, "Oh my God, how does he look so good?" Even though he wasn't that big, he was just relatively lean. Now it's that, except blown up even more. And the weird thing is that now we're seeing this 20-pound spike in muscle mass, but it happened when you're 7, 8 years into lifting already. That is a big deviation from this sort of natural progression that you would expect. That is kind of weird, and that is going to push them somewhat to the right on this spectrum. Look at this. Look at my assistant today. If you have someone who claims to be natural, but they just kind of coincidentally or accidentally only end up in untested shows or organizations, that is a bit of a red flag. So in America, this would be the NPC or the IFBB, which is kind of the professional version of the NPC. That's kind of the successor. Both of these leagues, their shows, 99% of the time have no testing. So this is no polygraph, no urinalysis, no blood, nothing. I mean, you're essentially setting yourself up to be the kids in that episode of Seinfeld when Kramer takes up karate. Yeah, you're putting yourself at a clear disadvantage, and I don't really see why. That being said, I do want to clarify that still, even competing in a natural show isn't perfect, because these shows, these organizations, a lot of times, their testing, it can't possibly be that rigorous. Even at the highest levels of competition, there are still plenty of examples of people who have beaten the system. But still, just the fact that they do something at all, that alone, I think, is enough to scare off probably the majority of the potential, cheaters. Anyway, to summarize, if you compete exclusively in untested shows, this does push you a bit to the right on my spectrum. But if you don't, you compete in natural shows, this does push you somewhat to the left. And maybe not all the way 100% to the left, but still a decent bump nonetheless. If you have someone who talks about everything else in their fitness life, their training, their supplementation, their nutrition, how many hours of sleep they get, how many dumps they take per day, they talk about everything, but then coincidentally, they never really address this question, even when it's posed to them in their comments, their YouTube DMs or whatever, all this stuff. That to me, it kind of answers your question right there. And also for the record, I want to say that you choosing to not talk about this is perfectly acceptable. I mean, yes, in a perfect world, it would be great if everybody on social media was very open and honest and transparent about what they do. And some people on social media do that, which I think is fantastic. But it's not a prerequisite. It is not a requirement for you to not be an asshole. But for the record, yeah, if you completely avoid this topic like the plague, I'm going to assume there's a reason for that. And I'm going to, in this case, push you to the right on the spectrum. It's kind of like, imagine if you were suspecting that your wife is cheating on you and you decided to confront her about this, and in response she just gave you... There is a theory that certain muscle groups in your body, namely your shoulders and your traps, your trapezius, because these muscle groups have greater concentrations of androgen receptors, they are then going to grow faster, almost disproportionately faster than other parts of the body, other muscle groups in the body. Androgen receptors is just kind of like a fancy way of saying essentially the receptors in your body which bind to testosterone. This could be natural testosterone or exogenously injected testosterone. So you can almost think of it kind of like androgen receptors are the baseball gloves, and the more baseball gloves you have to catch the baseballs, which in this case are testosterone, the more signals those complexes are going to send to the muscle wherever it is. And again, more so the shoulders and the traps, at least according to this theory. But there actually is one study I found, a paper from 1999, which does actually kind of support this theory. In this paper, they did two things. First, they looked at the androgen receptor concentration in two muscle groups, the traps and the vastus lateralis. And yes, they did find an increased androgen receptor concentration as predicted in the traps. However, to make matters even more interesting, they then repeated that analysis, except now they did it in different individuals. They specifically looked at people who don't work out, people who do work out, and then people who do work out and take anabolic steroids. And the fascinating thing is that they found an increased androgen receptor concentration, not just in the traps, but specifically in the traps of the guys taking anabolic steroids. So essentially it was like, it's like double increased, right? It was increased in the traps and then further increased in the traps of the guys taking gear. So to a certain extent, this paper actually kind of, I'm not going to say it confirmed it. I'm not going to say that that's it. This is objective scientific fact, but it is in a way evidence kind of supporting this hypothesis. But that being said, I actually am not going to include this as an official variable in my video. And the reason behind that is it's very error prone and very subjective. See, the problem is there is no way to accurately determine whether someone has like bigger traps or shoulders in comparison to something like their legs, for example. Is it because of this like weird biological androgen receptor concentration shenanigan mumbo jumbo? Or is it because the guy just hates leg day and does like 3 shoulder days a week? Or maybe they just have a genetically superior muscle group. I mean, we all have like, strengths and weaknesses. What if some individual strength just happens to be his shoulders or his traps? And so on that note, although I did think this was kind of cool, and hence why I wanted to mention it in the video, because this is like the first time I've actually seen any science support this up until now 100% bro science topic. That being said, I don't actually want to include it as an official variable in my model because it's just way too like error prone. All right, now we're going to get into some more physical, like visual characteristics. And the first one probably comes as no surprise to you, acne. It has long been considered or compared that taking anabolic steroids is similar to going on puberty. And to a certain extent, that's actually kind of true because a lot of like the effects that happen in both situations are very similar. You have an increase in things like libido or confidence or body hair, maybe some increase in things like aggression, muscularity, obviously, and yes, acne. However, there are a couple caveats to remember. The first one is that unfortunately there is a very strong link between acne and genetics, and essentially this means that there are some people out there who are just like juiced to the gills. They could be running like every compound you can think of for multiple cycles, and they'll never get breakouts. They will have perfect, clean, porcelain skin, all of their lives. On the other hand, there are other people who may do like a small amount for their first cycle and it just goes horribly. They just blow up and have the worst breakouts they've ever had. I think we've all seen those really kind of scary horror stories on YouTube. And the other kind of weird thing is that unlike traditional acne, which predominantly affects us in the facial area, steroid-induced acne seems to predominantly affect your body, especially your chest and your back. Back knee especially is a very common side effect. So in terms of like where it applies on the spectrum, if you have someone who really hasn't had like a long time battle with acne, and then suddenly out of nowhere they start to break out a bit more than like they ever have before, especially if it's on the back area, back and chest, and if it's also coincidentally around the time that maybe they're getting more muscular, leaner, then yeah. Okay, next up, gynecomastia or gyno is essentially when you have just somewhat of additional growth in breast tissue, specifically in men, resulting from an imbalance in their hormonal profile. Specifically, they have too much estrogen. Now, you guys might be wondering, like, estrogen, what the hell are you talking about? Where did that come from? I don't want none of that. I need the good stuff. I need testosterone. Yeah, that's the problem, because when you have excess levels of testosterone, it converts or aromatizes into excess levels of estrogen, which results in gyno. And especially when they raise their arm, you can actually see like there's almost like a little like, it almost looks kind of like a puffy halo around their nipple. Yeah, that's gyno. But I also want to clarify that gyno can still, unfortunately, absolutely occur naturally in men. This could be due to puberty or old age or obesity or just unfortunate, genetics. However, if you have someone and gyno seems to kind of like appear out of nowhere and maybe they haven't had like a long history of dealing with it, they are not obese, they are not 14 years old or 84 years old for that matter, then yeah, that's a little suspicious. And in this case on the spectrum, it pushes you a bit to the right. Have you ever noticed how a lot of like long-term steroid users, they all kind of end up looking like almost kind of similar? Like after 5 or so years, a lot of them end up balding or bald, and yet with like a really good thick beard. This can actually be directly attributed to anabolic steroids, namely those which are DHT derived or which convert into DHT, such as testosterone. Now, I did a whole video about this a few years ago, so if you want to know more, you can go watch that. But essentially, the TLDR version is that if baldness is already like something that runs in your family, if you are already predestined sometime in the future to probably start losing your hair, anabolic steroids can kind of speed this up and exacerbate it. Maybe if you are going to lose your hair at 40, it could speed it up so that it starts happening at 35 or maybe even earlier than that. Maybe like 30 or hell, even 25, depending on what you're taking, how long you're taking it, and the quantities and etc., etc. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still heavily based on your genetics, and there are just some guys who are very lucky and going to have perfectly full heads of hair well into their 60s. I mean, just look at some of these old school bodybuilders like, Tom Platz or Arnold or even Mike Menser towards the end of his life. However, for a lot of other people who may not be as fortunate genetically speaking, if you have someone who, used to have relatively good hair, and then seemingly relatively quickly, it seems like their scalp just aged 15 years into the future and their hair is now like twice as thin as it was maybe a few months ago or like a year or two ago, that might be a bit of a red flag. And at least in terms of our spectrum, that's going to push them a bit to the right. Okay, this one is somewhat more anecdotal, but during my research, this just kept on coming up time and time again, so I thought I would mention it. Have you ever seen those bodybuilders? These guys who just persistently look like they just stepped out of the sauna. Like their skin is just perpetually like 3 shades more red than everybody else around them. This is actually called skin flushing, and it could potentially be linked to anabolic steroid usage for a number of reasons, such as just increased blood pressure, increased body temperature, and even increased red blood cell count. Like your body is actually making more or too many red blood cells. This is actually one of the reasons why a lot of bodybuilders will actually try to donate blood as often as they can. They'll go every like 3 or 6 months or whatever the limit is. It's because their hematocrit levels are literally too high, and so they're trying to like offload red blood cells by just donating blood as frequently as they can. I know, this is wild shit. So again, similar to gyno or acne or any other physical characteristic, on its own in a vacuum, does like red skin indicate that you must be taking something? No, because there's like 300 other reasons why you might have skin flushing. But if you see this in conjunction with other variables I've already mentioned and a sudden rise in like leanness or muscularity, then again, it starts to paint a bit more of a picture, and at least in terms of our spectrum, pushes you to the right. Alright, next up. This one is kind of weird, but bear with me. Short height as a physical characteristic. Except, no, I'm not saying that short height is tied to steroid use. No, it's actually kind of the opposite. There have been 18 Mr. Olympias since all the way back in 1965, and actually only one of them has ever been over 6 feet tall, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The average of all the other 17 winners, they're all kind of like around like 5'8", maybe 5'9" or something. It really does seem like there's just like some kind of advantage to somewhat shorter guys in terms of building a truly like stacked, thick, round, muscle-bellied, complete physique. I've even seen like memes about this online, so it's not just me who thinks this. And so the way that I apply this to the actual spectrum, essentially, if I see an individual who's a bit on the shorter side, that's not like inherently going to make them more likely to be natural. But essentially, if they otherwise have a very impressive physique, you know, they have like a large amount of muscle, maybe their FFMI is like 24 or 5 or something, I am inclined to be a little bit more forgiving and a little bit less skeptical if they're a bit on the shorter side, as opposed to if they were like that jacked and like 6'3". Again, it's not impossible, but it's considerably harder to achieve, and therefore I'm a little bit more skeptical. Okay, to clarify, when I say environment, I am not talking about like the country that you live in, or the weather, or that like climate change is actively connected to steroid use.
And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of
anabolic steroids.
No, I'm specifically referring to like the people like around you. I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say that like, look, if you hang out all the time with a bunch of guys who are just juiced to the gills, it's probably going to take a little bit of extra willpower for you to resist, the temptation.
You sure you're still natty?
Not for long. Bro, being around the twins, bro, I think I'm gonna send it.
You could do it safely, bro. Like, just get the bare minimum and still become, like, if you take a good amount of tests, like, you can be healthier.
So, yeah, in this situation, although it is very subjective and kind of, like, speculative, but if you surround yourself with a bunch of people and everyone seems to be on gear but you aren't, I mean, yes, that is absolutely possible, and some people can resist the urge, the temptation, but also, I'm definitely going to be a bit more skeptical. Okay, now probably the moment that a lot of you guys have been waiting for. We're going to be applying all of the variables to some examples and seeing how does the natural spectrum, how does it actually work? And I thought the best example to kind of start with, at least for fun, would be to use someone where we actually already know the answer. You know who I'm talking about, everybody's favorite testicle munching barbarian, Liver King. FFMI, the current stats that I found, actually straight from Liver King's website, 5'7", 186 pounds. This gives him an FFMI of 27.5, which right off the bat is huge. This alone would probably be enough to disqualify him for most of you in terms of what is achievable naturally, but for curiosity's sake, let's keep going. Perpetually low body fat percentage. Yes, this absolutely applies to him. I have never, literally, in the last 3 years of Liver King being social media famous, I have never seen this man above 10% body fat. Uncommon muscle trajectory. Yes, I would say that probably applies to him as well. No natural competitions. This doesn't apply to him because obviously he doesn't compete in bodybuilding. Avoiding the question. This one actually is in his favor. And this is one of the crappy things, because somebody who doesn't avoid the question, someone who's open about their natural status and proud of it, it only means two things. Either that is actually the case, or you're just a perpetual liar, which unfortunately was the case here. But nonetheless, this moves you a bit to the left. Acne, gyno, baldness, all three of these don't affect Liver King, which means we are not going to be moving him to the right. We're not going to be moving him to the left either. We're kind of just put these as not applicable. Except this fourth one, red flush skin. This one, hell yeah, it affects him. Liver King perpetually, 100% of the time, looks like he has just stepped out of a sauna 2 minutes ago. Now, to be honest, this also could be due to the fact that he lives in Texas and doesn't believe in sunscreen, so he looks like he's just perpetually sunburned 90% of the year. But nonetheless, in this case, we're moving you to the right. Short height. This one also technically actually kind of is in his favor. Liver King, although being very jacked, is also a little bit on the short side, which does make it, it makes it a little bit more believable. Maybe not 27.5 FFMI believable, but still, nonetheless, this does move you a bit to the left. And then finally for environment, this one I'm going to leave as NA because I really don't... He's a weird example. And so the final verdict with Liver King, I'm going to give this a 99-1. This is the way I recommend you think about this. Don't think about this as a yes or a no, as a natty or a not. Think about this in terms of like betting odds. Let's say you came to me and you said, Igor, I want you to bet that Liver King is natural. I would need 99-1 odds for it to be worth my time. Meaning I'm going to bet $1. And if I win, you owe me $100. A massive payout for something with very, very little odds. It's kind of like going to like a roulette table at the casino and you bet at like one number, right? It's a very high chance you're going to lose because your chances of winning are like 1 out of 36. But if you do win, you don't double your money. No, you win 36 times your money. You bet $10, you walk out of there with almost $400. For me to take a bet arguing he's natural, you're going to have to give me some crazy good odds. All right, moving on, let's do one more example. This time I want to kind of do the opposite. Someone who, at least in my opinion, I do believe when they say they are natural. Max Taylor, popular YouTuber, social media bodybuilder. It's very, I'll be honest, it's kind of challenging to get his actual stats, but doing a bit of digging, I would estimate Max is around 5'11", 170-ish pounds. He said he was 175 in a full day of eating video that was right before his show. So assuming, a little bit further depletion, 170 pounds, 8% body fat-ish, give or take. And again, if these stats are off by a little bit, it'll change the FFMI, but it's not going to change it that much. Like me getting his body fat percentage off by like 1 or 2% is not going to catapult him to like 28. Perpetually low body fat percentage, no, that does not apply to him. Max does very normal, healthy fluctuations between when he's cutting down for a show and when he's bulking up and just living his life normally. Uncommon muscle trajectory also doesn't apply to him. Scrolling back on his social media, on his Instagram and TikTok, it seems like he has slowly, normally put on muscle. The majority of his gains were in the first few years, and then since then he's sort of like continued to refine his physique. No natural competitions, and avoiding the question, both of these do not pertain to Max. He is open about the fact that he is a proud natural athlete, and also he has competed in the WNBF, which is in fact a natural organization. Acne, no. Gyno, no. Baldness, red flush skin, all of which, no. Max doesn't have any of these things, at least not at this time. He's not a short guy either. And his environment, this one again is also hard to say because once you get to that large social media level, similar to Liver King, you just collaborate and do videos with like everyone, natural, not natural, all over the place. So in his situation, it's kind of hard to say as to who his core group of friends or family or whatever is. So I'm just going to leave this one as not applicable. If you were to come to me and you were to say, Igor, I want you to bet that Max is natural and I'll give you 50-50 odds, I will take that bet. I will take that bet any day of the week because in my opinion, I'm like 80, maybe even 90% sure that I'm going to win. So in my opinion, that bet, easy money. And so the last thing I probably want to mention in this video, and this honestly, this is why this video has taken me so long to make. I've probably like rewritten the script like 3 times over the last month because again, it is a difficult question to answer or even a difficult topic just to approach. And also the kind of shitty thing is that nowadays, I think more so than back when when I first started on YouTube, now with there being so much more information out there on the topic of PEDs and just a lot more access in terms of the internet, it's essentially becoming easier and easier to, in essence, be a fake natural. If you want an example of this, unfortunately, just look at Dylan McKnight, someone who just a few weeks ago came out about the fact that he himself he used the SARM cycle and did get some significant benefits out of it, but then continued to claim to be natural both on social media and unfortunately in competition. And so this kind of brings me to the last thing I wanted to mention, which is one of the reasons why I made this video, this 2 videos. There's this guy. He's a young kid. I'm just going to call him Bill. Bill is a former client of mine. I've coached people for years now, and Bill's a young kid. I think he was a kid when we first started working together. He was like 17 or something. And he has got a phenomenal physique. Not just for like people his age, but just for people in general. He looks really good in terms of muscle, in terms of like, you know, conditioning. He's stronger at like 18 than I was at like 23, 24, after I've already been, you know, lifting hard for a few years. And yet he messages me because, like, you know, we worked together years ago, but we still kind of keep in touch every now and then. And he seemed really almost like kind of down about his physique. And he was talking about how he's like, listen, I've accepted that I'm never going to be that big. I've accepted that like almost like bodybuilding isn't for me. And I'm going to focus on some other stuff. I couldn't help but be kind of sad. He's not even 20 years old. He's still technically a teenager. And he's already kind of got this defeatist mentality because he believes that, well, number one, he doesn't have an impressive physique, which is wrong, and also that he can never get a good physique. Good being the standard that he has in his mind, which I think is heavily influenced by stuff like social media, you know, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, where you've got like 19-year-olds deadlifting 7 plates and walking around at 220 pounds. They're just sauced up to the tits. And like that is it's gonna fuck with your brain no matter who you are. It did for me, and I'm like a 30-year-old man. I can't imagine what it's like to be an 18, 19-year-old kid, download TikTok for the first time, and suddenly everyone makes you feel like shit because although your body's good, it's not top 0.1 percentile good. I don't want people to be absolute cynics where everybody with like an FFMI over 21 has to be, you know, you're absolutely not possible to attain naturally. That's bullshit. But at the same time, I also don't want people to be just completely naive where everyone on the internet is all puppies and sunshines and rainbows and it's fucking Care Bears. And if someone says that they're 100% natural, then gosh darn it, they absolutely are.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
No, that's bullshit. We've seen this time and time and time again. Anyway, that's it, guys. I'm done with this topic. At least for the next 2 years or so, at which point we'll reset the cycle and I'll probably end up talking about it again. Or maybe not.